I'm also watching this. I'm logged in as a participant on my laptop, so I can see what's happening on the other end. And it looks like it's not going to allow me entrance. And oh yeah, now I did. Okay.
Hello, my name is Kurt Geisinger, and I have the great honor of being president of Division 52, International Psychology of the American Psychological Association for 2022. And I want to welcome you all to our webinar series celebrating our 25th anniversary. Being 25 years old is quite an accomplishment for our division, which was founded as a way of saying to the American Psychological Association, we need to be more international, and we are celebrating that. And we believe we have given a lot of leadership on international affairs to the American Psychological Association, and we've seen in recent years just how important that is. Now, as part of this celebration, we have a series right now of 6 webinars, and we might add some more. And among our speakers is a very distinguished group of people, including Denny Wedding and Bridget Corey and Rolando Diaz-Loving, Janel Gauthier, Lori Foster, and Florence Denmark and Harold Takuzian. You're going to hear one of those speakers in the next few moments, and I wish you a great learning experience and a great year celebrating our 25th anniversary. Thank you very much.
Great. At this point, I'm going to allow Janel to share his screen again, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Neil Rubin to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Geisinger. Thank you to the members of the board and everyone who's been involved in developing this really fabulous celebration of the 25th anniversary of the division. I've been a long time admirer of Janel Gauthier. I met him originally in 2008 at the International Congress in Berlin. I believe it was the occasion of the launch of the Universal Declaration of Ethical Principles for Psychologists. Janel had organized outstanding ethicists from around the world to put together this crucial document that we have benefited from ever since. I think we spoke again, Janel, in 2015 when you were invited guest at the United Nations for Psychology Day, and we had the opportunity to speak then. When we were putting together our recent book, the Cambridge Handbook of Psychology and Human Rights, we knew that we needed to open the book with the voice of someone who had a really very thoughtful, kind of profound perspective on ethics to set the stage for things. And so we reached out to Dr. Gauthier, and we're really lucky enough to have his perspective on human rights and ethics in the 21st century. He is a voice of really leading our profession internationally, and not only in terms of professional conduct, but more importantly to advancing the ethical and moral conduct of all of humanity. So to introduce him, he is the Professor Emeritus at Laval University in Quebec City, Quebec, Canada, past president of the IAAP and the Canadian Psychological. He has received numerous international and national awards for his contributions to education and the training of psychologists and the international advancement of psychology and ethics. In Division 52, he was the 2015 award winner of our Outstanding International Psychologist Award. So at a time when we are seeing vast inhumanity in several places around the world, Dr. Gauthier puts before us in his title a question: the process of moral disengagement. What have we learned, and what does it mean for the maintenance of moral standards in societies? Dr. Gauthier, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Neil, for this very kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for having me. I'm pleased and honored to be here and be given the opportunity to make a contribution to the 25th anniversary of the Division 52 International Psychology. The title of my presentation is The Process of Modal Disengagement. What have we learned and what does it mean for the maintenance of modal standards in societies? I chose the topic of my presentation last February before Russia attacked Ukraine. The recent barbaric, unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the response from world leaders to Russia's attack on Ukraine makes it more important and relevant than ever to learn about the various mechanisms of modal disengagement to keep modal disengagement in check and uphold modal standards. Modal disengagement is a human problem at both individual and collective levels. In a book entitled Everybody Does It, Thomas Gabor documents the pervasiveness of modal disengagement in all walks of life. This book explores crime committed by the ordinary citizens, that is, those who are not habitually in conflict with the law. In his book, Gabor shows that so-called respectable citizens account for a large proportion of many kinds of crime: theft, fraud, tax evasion, assault, sex offenses, business scams, political and corporate crime, environmental crime, technological crime, and mass lawlessness such as looting. Studying and understanding why people do bad things and how otherwise good people can do cruel things are important questions because it has implications for the maintenance of moral standards in societies. The moral standards people adopt serve as guides for conduct and deterrents for detrimental activities. People do things that bring them satisfaction and a sense of self-worth and refrain from violating their moral standards because such conduct gives rise to self-condemnation. Self-sanctions keep conduct in line with internal standards. However, moral standards do not function as fixed internal regulators of moral conduct. There are many psychosocial maneuvers by which people selectively disengage moral self-sanctions from inhuman or unethical conduct. This enables them to do cruel things or unethical things with freedom from the restraints of self-censure. Indeed, large-scale inhumanities are often perpetrated by people who are compassionate in other aspects of their lives. They can even behave compassionately and cruelly at the same time, depending on the persons they include and exclude in their category of humanity. I will give one or two examples of this in my presentation later. How to move next slide. Up here. Okay. All right. Now, I hope you're still with me. Okay, research aiming to understand how otherwise good people can do cruel or unethical things has been conducted in psychology over the last 2 decades at least. This body of research shows that the self-regulatory mechanisms governing moral conduct can be selectively disengaged from inhuman or unethical conduct. And one of the leaders in that field has been Bandura. He has identified 8 such mechanisms of moral evasion. The purpose of this presentation is to review those mechanisms and describe how this knowledge can be used to uphold compassionate behavior, renounce cruelty, defeat moral disengagement, and maintain virtue. Now we're going to start to have a look at the mechanisms of moral disengagement, starting with moral justification. The prime mode of moral disengagement operates through a cognitive reconstruction of the detrimental behavior itself. In this process of moral justification, Such conduct is made personally and socially acceptable by portraying it as serving socially worthy or moral purposes. People then act on a moral imperative and preserve their view of themselves as a moral agent while inflicting harm on others. Through moral justification of violent means, they see themselves as protecting cherished values, fighting ruthless oppressors, preserving peace, saving humanity from subjugation, or honoring righteous commitments. Voltaire put it well when he said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." Over the centuries, much inhuman conduct has been perpetrated by ordinary, decent people in the name of righteous ideologies, religious principles, and nationalistic imperatives. Widespread ethnic wars are producing atrocities of appalling proportions. When viewed from divergent perspectives, the same violent acts are different things to different people. It is often proclaimed in conflicts of power that one group's terroristic activity is another group's liberation movement fought by heroic fighters. This is why moral appeals against violence usually fall on deaf ears. Adversaries sanctify their own militant actions, but condemn those of their antagonists as barbarity masquerading under a mask of outrageous moral reasoning. Each side feels morally superior to the other. Among the set of mechanisms, moral justification is uniquely powerful. This is because it serves dual functions. It enlists ardent moral engagement in the worthy cause, but moral disengagement in its injurious and destructive execution. Language is widely used to make detrimental conduct socially and personally acceptable. In an insightful analysis of the language of non-responsibility, Gambino identifies different varieties of euphemisms. One form relies on sanitizing language. Consider, by way of example, aerial bombardment. Bombers do not drop bombs and hang onto your seat. They drop vertically deployed anti-personnel devices. Bombing missions are described as servicing the target in the likeness of a public utility, or as visiting a site in the likeness of a social call. The attacks become clean surgical strikes, arousing imagery of curative activities. Bombing errors that kill civilians are characterized as outside current accuracy requirements. As you well know, the civilians the bombs kill are linguistically converted to collateral damage. Latest one comes from Russia, where the term special military operation is used to describe Russia's assault on Ukraine. In fact, as you probably have heard, they have made it illegal to call the invasion of Ukraine a war, and you can go to prison for this. The agentless passive voice serves as another self-exonerative linguistic tool. It creates the appearance that detrimental acts are the work of nameless forces rather than people. It is as though people are moved mechanically, but are not really the agents of their own acts. Even inanimate objects are sometimes turned into agents. Here is a driver explaining to police how he managed to demolish a telephone pole. The telephone pole was approaching. I was attempting to swerve out of its way when it struck my front end. The specialized jargon of a legitimate enterprise can also be exploited to lend an aura of respectability to an illegitimate one. In the vocabulary of the lawbreakers in Nixon's administration, criminal conspiracy became a game plan, and the conspirators were team players, like the best of sportsmen or sportsperson, if you prefer. How behavior is viewed is colored by what it is compared against. By exploiting the contrast principle, reprehensible acts can be made righteous. For example, terrorists see their behavior as acts of selfless martyrdom by comparing them with widespread cruelties inflicted on the people with whom they identify. The more flagrant the contrasting inhumanities, the more likely it is that one's destructive conduct will appear benevolent. Violence is made morally acceptable by claiming that one's injurious actions will prevent more human suffering than they cause. For example, the massive destruction of the countryside in Vietnam by means of Agent Orange was minimized by portraying the American military intervention as being a lot better for the Vietnamese people than being enslaved by the communists. Expedient historical comparison also serves self-exonerating purposes. Apologists for the lawlessness of political figures they support point to transgressions by rival administration as vindications. Adapters of violent means are quick to point out that democracies, such as those of France and the United States, for example, were achieved through violence against oppressive rule. There was no other way. Under displaced responsibility, people committing harmful acts view their action as stemming from the directives of another person or dictate of authorities. They do not view themselves as personally responsible for them. Since they are not the actual agent of their actions, they are spared self-condemning reactions. In such circumstances, they are unlikely to experience deterrent emotions such as guilt. Exemption from self-evaluation for gross inhumanities by displacement of responsibility is most gruesomely revealed in socially sanctioned mass executions. Nazi prison commandants and their staffs divested themselves of personal responsibility for their unprecedented inhumanities. They claimed they were simply carrying out orders. A number of social factors affect the ease with which responsibility for one's actions can be surrendered to others. High justification and social consensus about the morality of an enterprise aid in a relinquishment of personal control. The legitimacy of the authorizers is another important determinant. The higher the authorities, the more legitimacy, respect, and coercive power they command, and the more amenable are people to defer to them. Moral control is also weakened through diffusion of responsibility for detrimental behavior. Kelman and Hamilton identify 3 ways in which responsibility is dispersed. A sense of responsibility can be diffused and thereby diminished by division of labor. Most enterprises require the services of many people, each performing subdivided jobs that seem harmless in themselves. After activities become routinized into detached subfunctions, people shift their attention from the morality of what they're doing to the operational details and efficiency of their specific job. An example here of this can be found in execution team in prisons. Each member straps, for those, for example, who have to go on the electric chair, each member straps a particular part of the body, left leg, left arm, torso, right arm, torso, head, and so on. And one is responsible for cleaning the electrodes, another one to apply them. And they take great pride in doing what they call a job for the state. And they say if the electrodes are clean, it should make it easier on the inmate when they're electrocuted. A second mechanism is diffusion is group decision making. It's another common practice that gets otherwise considerate people to behave inhumanly. As psychologists, we all know that when everyone is responsible, no one really feels responsible. Social organizations go to great lengths to devise mechanisms for obscuring responsibility for decisions that will affect others adversely. Collective action is still another expedient for weakening moral control. Any harm done by a group can always be attributed largely to the behavior of others. As shown in the Zimbardo's 1971 Stanford prison experiment, people act more cruelly under group responsibility than when they hold themselves personally accountable for their actions. Other ways of weakening moral control operate by minimizing, disregarding, or disputing the harmful effects of one's actions. As long as the harmful effects are out of sight and out of mind, there is little reason for self-censure to be activated. We're now in the era of satellite and laser-guided hardware wars. These technologies have become highly lethal and depersonalized, with mass destruction delivered remotely via satellite-guided system with no human contact. For example, you have now today officers that operate pilotless drones from a control center somewhere in a country. The cameras aboard the drones identify possible suspects in another country, Iraq, Afghanistan, it can be now Ukraine or wherever it is in the world. The operator fires rockets that blow them up. This remotely implemented faceless warfare underscores the extraordinary flexibility of moral regulation of conduct. The operators switch their moral control on and off daily between their military working hours and their off-duty life. Most organizations involve hierarchical chains of command in which superiors formulate plans and intermediaries transmit them to functionaries or to others who then carry them out. The farther removed individuals are from the destructive end results, the weaker is the restraining power of injurious effects. Disengagement of moral control is easiest for the intermediaries in a hierarchical system. Why? Because they neither bear responsibility for the decision, nor do they carry them out and face the harm being inflicted. The strength of moral self-censure also depends on how the perpetrators regard their enemies or opponents. To perceive another as human activates empathetic reactions through a sense of common humanity. It is difficult to mistreat humanized persons without self-condemnation. Hence, self-censure for harmful conduct can be disengaged or blunted by stripping people of human qualities. If stripping one's enemies or opponents of humanness do not weaken self-censure, it can be eliminated by attributing demonic or bestial qualities to them. They become things such as satanic friends, degenerates, vermin, and other bestial creatures. It's easier to brutalize people when they're viewed as low animal forms. During wartime, nations cast their enemies in the most dehumanized, demonic, and bestial images to make it easier to kill them. The process of dehumanization is an essential ingredient in the perpetration of inhumanities. Levi reported an incident in which a Nazi camp commandant was asked why the Nazis went to such extreme lengths to degrade their victims, whom they were going to kill anyway. The commandant chillingly explained that it was not a matter of purposeless cruelty. Rather, the victims had to be degraded to the level of subhuman objects so that those who operated the gas chambers would be less burdened by distress and guilt. Another example, a very recent one, this one, is Vladimir Putin of Russia, who says that Ukraine's government is openly neo-Nazi and pro-Nazi and controlled by literal Nazis. And you know how much Russians love Nazis. So it's the equivalent of putting Ukrainian people at the rank of subhumans, people that you must hate. Blaming one's adversaries or circumstances is still another expedient that can serve exonerating purposes. In this process, people view themselves as faultless victims driven to injurious conduct by forcible provocation. The devil made me do it. Thus, punitive conduct is seen as a justifiable defense reaction to belligerent provocations. Self-exoneration is also achievable by viewing one's harmful conduct as forced by compelling circumstances rather than as a personal decision. By fixing the blame on others or on circumstances, not only are one's injurious actions excusable, but one can feel self-righteous in the process. This is what makes it so insidious. Justified abuse can have more devastating human consequences than acknowledged cruelty. Mistreatment that is not clothed in righteousness makes the perpetrator rather than the victim blameworthy. However, when victims are convincingly blamed for their plight, they eventually may come to believe the degrading characterization of themselves. Thus, exonerating inhumanity is more likely to instill self-contempt in victims than inhumanity that does not attempt to justify itself. Seeing victims suffer maltreatment for which they are held partially responsible leads observers to denigrate them. The devaluation and indignation aroused by ascribed culpability provides further moral justification for even greater maltreatment. Now, let's have a look at the characteristics of moral disengagement mechanisms. They have many things in common. The mechanisms of moral disengagement have several important characteristics in common. First, in the transaction of everyday life, they operate together to disengage moral self-sanctions. They rarely operate individually. This slide shows the point where moral self-sanctions are selectively disengaged from reprehensible behavior in the process of moral self-regulation. As shown here, the mechanisms of moral disengagement operate in concert at 4 different points. First, the disengagement may center on redefining harmful conduct as honorable by moral justification, exonerating social comparison, and sanitizing language. Second, it may focus on agency of action so that perpetrators can minimize their role in causing harm by diffusion and displacement of responsibility. Third, it may involve minimizing or distorting the harmful effect or consequences that flow from detrimental actions. And fourth, the disengagement may include dehumanizing and blaming the victims of the maltreatment. Moral actions are also the product of the reciprocal interplay of personal and social influences. Personal influences include cognitive and affective influences, our beliefs, our emotions, and so on. Conflict arises between self-sanctions and social sanctions when individuals are punished socially for courses of action that they regard as right and just. Principled dissenters and nonconformists often find themselves in this predicament. Some sacrifice their welfare for their convictions. People also commonly experience conflicts in which they are socially pressured to engage in conduct that violates their moral standards. Responses to such moral dilemmas are determined by the relative strength of self-sanction and social sanctions. To see which ones override the other depends on the strength of each one. Sorry, not there yet. Disengagement practices do not instantly transform considerate people into cruel ones. Rather, the change is achieved, and this is very important to remember, is achieved by progressive disengagement of self-censure. Initially, individuals perform mildly harmful or aggressive acts they can tolerate with some discomfort. After their self-reproof has been diminished through repeated enactments, the level of ruthlessness increases until eventually acts originally regarded as despicable can be performed with little anguish or self-censure. At this point, inhuman practices become thoughtlessly routinized. Because of the gradualness of the transformation, people may not even recognize the changes their moral selves have undergone. Moral disengagement is not confined to individuals acting independently. Quite the contrary. The mechanisms of moral disengagement often operate on a large scale with multiple interdependent social systems. Collective moral disengagement at the social system level requires a network of participants vindicating their harmful practices. Consider by way of example, the widespread moral compromises across multiple social systems in the tobacco industry. Contributors to the promotion of this deadly product included a vast network of otherwise considerate people engaged in a bewildering array of occupations, including top executives of tobacco companies, chemists, scientists, lobbyists, movie actors who were promoting the product, pharmacists, farmers, lawyers, legislators, and so on. Moral disengagement does not alter moral standards, contrary to what we might think. Rather, it provides the means for those who morally disengage to circumvent moral standards in a way that strip morality from harmful behavior and their responsibility for it. However, in other aspects of their lives, they adhere to their moral standards. It is the selective suspension of morality for harmful or reprehensible activities that enables people to retain their positive self-regard while doing harm or engaging in unethical behavior. People can even be ruthless and compassionate simultaneously toward different individuals, again, depending on who they include and exclude from their category of humanity. This selectivity of moral engagement is strikingly illustrated in the novel Schindler's List that was turned into a movie later on. The novel describes a situation involving a notorious Nazi commandant in a concentration camp in German-occupied Poland. While dictating a letter filled with empathy and compassion for his sick father, he saw a prisoner on the grounds outside who he thought was not working hard enough. He pulled out his revolver and callously shot the prisoner. The commandant was both overcome with compassion and savagely cruel at the very same time. Moral disengagement, the example I've given you are examples that maybe, they exist in wartime and so on around the world, but as Neil mentioned at the beginning of when he introduced me, inhumanities is all around us, all around the world. But it's also important to see that it is part of everyday life. Moral disengagement exists in everyday life and comes in different shapes and forms. As an example, imagine that Sam has an internal standard that prohibits theft, but has taken a newspaper without paying for it from, say, Starbucks. Moral disengagement mechanisms help Sam construe taking the newspaper as no big deal. This is distortion of consequences. Believe that everyone takes small things like a paper sometimes. Diffusion of responsibility. That taking the paper is tiny compared to other violations. Advantageous comparison. Or that he has seen Starbucks employees take copies of the paper, so why should he? This is called displacement of responsibility. It could think that in the grand scheme of things, being an informed citizen is more important than paying for the paper. Moral justification. It could even plan on leaving the paper in the cafe when he is finished with it. So really, it was just borrowing it. That's called euphemistic labeling. It could think that Starbucks is a large, heartless corporation that won't notice the missing paper, dehumanization, or think that Starbucks deserves having the paper taken from it because it overcharges its consumers and does not purchase all its coffee beans from certified fair trade sources. Attribution of blame. These mechanisms facilitate understanding his behavior as unrelated to his internal standard against theft. Thus, he can leave the store, paper under arm, confident in the belief that he has done nothing wrong. Now, let's have a look at just a few research examples. Research has shown that moral disengagement plays a key role in daily life. Here are some examples. Research has shown that moral disengagement play a key role in institutionalized discrimination of the valued subgroup in society, in sexual abuse of women and child abuse, in military and political violence, in social and economic inequities, in bullying and cyberbullying, in corruption and dishonesty in the corporate world, be it finance, tobacco, involving lead, corporation, asbestos mines, chemical, coal, and so on. And also play a key role in the environmental degradation. So time is flying, so I will move on to the second part of my speech, which here deals with how do we defeat moral disengagement? What are the implications of that knowledge? What use does it have to maintain moral standards in society? The knowledge about the mechanisms of moral disengagement has important implications for the maintenance of moral standards in societies. I'll discuss those implications on their two major headings. And one I will call the power of resolute moral engagement, and the second I'll call the power of humanization. And I'm using the term power to show that we're far from being powerless. Let's start with the power of resolute moral engagement. As shown in this figure and on this slide, the mechanisms of moral disengagement can be defeated by proactively activating the mechanisms of moral engagement in nurturing the development and application of those mechanisms in everyday life through moral education and training. For example, our response to pseudo-moral justification should be, we are going to consider only principled moral arguments. Beware of euphemistic labeling. Tell it like it is. Beware of advantageous comparison. Look at better alternative. Nothing wrong with comparison, but don't compare with what is not so good. Compare with what is better and strive to do better. Displacement of responsibility and diffusion of responsibility can be counteracted by identifying a moral agency and accepting responsibility for actions and asking people to accept responsibilities for their actions. Blaming the victim. The focus should be on exonerating, pardoning the victim, and not of the least, dehumanizing the other, to be counteracted by humanizing the other people. Proactive moral action is regulated in large part by what I call resolute engagement of the mechanisms of moral agency. In the exercise of proactive morality, people take actions. For example, they actively are involved in protesting war, providing refuge to refugees, and that sort of thing. They act in the name of human principles when social circumstances dictate expedient, transgressive, and detrimental conduct. They disavow use of valued social ends to justify destructive means. They may even go to the extent of sacrificing their well-being for their convictions and their moral beliefs. They take personal responsibility for the consequences of their actions. They remain sensitive to the suffering of others, and they see human commonalities rather than distance themselves from others or divest them of human qualities. The exercise of moral agency has a dual aspect, and I emphasize this: the inhibitive aspect and the proactive aspect. The inhibitive form is manifested in the ability to refrain from inhumanly or of behaving inhumanly or unethically. The proactive form is manifested in compassion for the suffering of others and efforts to further their well-being, often at personal cost. In cases of proactive moral courage, individuals prevail as moral agents over entrenched social practices that are unjust, unethical, and inhumane. An all-embracing morality includes doing good things, not just refraining from bad ones. And this applies also to our code of ethics and psychology, ethical guidelines, and what have you. Regretfully, however, theories of morality focus on the inhibitive form more intensively than on the proactive one. Hence, the term the power of resolute moral engagement. Given the many psychological devices for disengaging moral control, societies cannot rely entirely on individuals to deter human cruelty. Civilized life requires, in addition to human personal codes, effective social safeguards against the misuse of power for exploitative and destructive purposes. Monolithic socio-political systems that exercise tight control over institutional and communication systems can have and use greater power of moral disengagement than can pluralistic systems that represent diverse perspectives, interests, and concerns. Political diversity and institutional protection of dissent allow challenges to suspect moral appeals. Healthy skepticism toward moral pretensions puts a further check on the misuse of morality for inhuman purposes. Some of the efforts at change must be directed at institutional practices that insulate the higher echelons from accountability for the detrimental policies over which they preside. Discourses that cloth inhuman activities in sanitizing language should be stripped of their euphemistic cover. Some of the moral disengagement is in the service of profit rather than political purposes. Corporate practices that have injurious, inhuman effects must be monitored, subjected to negative sanctions, and widely publicized to enlist the public support needed to change them. Regardless of whether inhuman practices are institutional, organizational, or individual, it should be made difficult for people to remove humanity from their conduct. Now, a few words about the power of humanization. Psychological analysis tend to emphasize how easy it is to bring out the worst in people through dehumanization. However, the power of humanization to counteract cruelty is equally striking, but receives relatively little attention. Let me give you an example of how the affirmation of common humanity can bring out the best in others. The story is a true story. It happened in the village of My Lai during a military massacre in March 1968 at the height of the Vietnam War. A US platoon led by a lieutenant had slaughtered more than 500 women, children, and elderly men. Young girls and women were raped and mutilated before being killed. A picture is worth 1,000 words. See this picture, it was published in black and white, not in color, to avoid shocking the readers of the newspaper at the time. Hugh Thompson, a young helicopter pilot, moved his helicopter downward quickly over the village of My Lai on a search and destroy mission as the massacre was occurring. He spotted an injured girl, marked the spot with a smoke signal, and radioed for help. Much to his horror, he saw a soldier flip her over and spray her with a round of machine gun fire. Upon seeing the human carnage in an irrigation ditch and soldiers firing into the bodies, he realized that he was in the midst of a massacre. He was moved to proactive moral action by the side of a terrified woman with a baby in her arms and a child clinging to her leg. He explained his sense of common humanity later by saying, "These people were looking at me for help, and there is no way I could turn my back on them." He told the commanding officer to help him remove the remaining villagers. The officer replied, "The only help they'll get is a hand grenade." Thompson moved his helicopter into the line of fire and commanded his gunner to fire on his approaching countrymen if they tried to harm the villagers. He radioed the accompanying gunships for help, and together they airlifted the remaining dozen villagers to safety. He flew back to the irrigation ditch where they found and rescued a 2-year-old boy still clinging to his dead mother. Tom described his empathetic human linkage by saying, "I had a son at home about the same age." Thompson's killing mission abruptly had turned into a humanitarian one. When people see and hear the suffering they cause, they find it difficult to behave destructively. I have additional examples. Being pressed for time, I will just skip another one that I had. So I will move on to say the effect of perceived common humanity is so powerful that it can turn hatred into compassion, reconciliation, and so on. The affirmation of common humanity can foster peaceable relationships among people. Nelson Mandela, for example, singularly displaced hatred of apartheid with reconciliation by affirming people's common humanity. Social psychology often emphasizes the power of the environmental forces, social, political, or what have you, over the individual forces. In the case of proactive and remarkable moral courage, the individual triumphs as a moral agent over compelling environmental pressures to behave otherwise. Such moral heroism is most strikingly documented in rescuers who risk their lives, often over prolonged periods of time, filled with extreme danger for themselves and their families, to save persecuted Jews during the Holocaust. They had no prior acquaintance with those they sheltered and had nothing material or social to gain by doing so. A resolute personal obligation for the welfare of persecuted individuals overrode self-concern despite the grave risks and heavy burdens the extended protective care entailed. It's interesting to note that rescuers view their behavior as a human duty rather than as extraordinary acts of moral heroism. In closing, remember, people live with the self-evaluative consequences of what they do. Moral self-sanctions keep behavior in line with moral standards. Yes, to some extent. However, they are insufficient to curb unethical and inhuman behavior. Even the power of moral self-sanctions can be neutralized. The psychosocial mechanisms by which this neutralization is achieved are the same for all individuals in all walks of everyday life, regardless of where you live in the world. Moral disengagement operates at the personal level under the influence of a host of factors, including cognitive, emotional, social, economic, political, and so on, that come into play in the flow of everyday life. It enables people to behave unethically and still live in peace with themselves. And that includes psychologists. The mechanisms of moral disengagement operate together. They are the product of the reciprocal interplay between personal, that is internal, and social, that is external influences. They transform considerate people into unethical ones progressively, not instantly. The slippery slope toward unethical behavior is insidious, gradual, subtle. Beware of pseudo-moral justifications, euphemisms, advantageous comparisons, displacement or diffusion of responsibility, misrepresenting, minimizing, or disregarding consequences, blaming the victim, dehumanizing the other person or people. The best way to counteract these mechanisms is to act proactively by engaging the mechanisms of moral agency with determination and focusing on our common humanity. One of the most striking findings of research on moral disengagement is the extraordinary power of humanization to curb inhuman practices. Whether on the battlefield or in vengeful social relationships, people cannot persuade themselves to behave cruelly toward humanized others despite strong social pressure to do so. These findings shed some light on how to cultivate a human society. Seeing common humanity in others arouses empathy and compassion toward them. It also instills a sense of shared responsibility for the quality of life in a society. The sense of common humanity is developed through shared relation experiences that link one's own well-being to the well-being of others. These interpersonal conditions are essential to the development of inclusive, socially just, and humane societies. They apply to individuals, organizations, government, and societies around the world, both locally and globally. We do have knowledge in psychology that can help build a better world. It is our responsibilities as psychologists to use it and promote it for the betterment of all persons and all peoples around the world. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Janel. We do have just a couple of minutes here for some questions. If anybody would like to type those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, we can have Dr. Gauthier answer those before we go.
Neil,
I don't know
perhaps you can read them to him.
Yeah, the only one that I have now is a comment from Dr. Greg Gormanis, and he just wanted to let everybody know as an FYI that Hugh Thompson from South Louisiana passed away in the last year or so. And he comments that he has had moral principles like steel, which I think he demonstrated there in that massacre situation. If there are other questions or comments that people would like to post, now is a good time to do that.
I will jump in with a comment, which is simply to say, Janel, that was a tour de force. You have explained things in ways I could only hope to do at some point in the future.
Thank you for your kind words. It's I'm touched. Thank you. Maybe I could make an additional comment if there are no other additional questions or comments. For me,
I do have one question, Janel,
yes, please,
if you don't mind.
Yes.
Two just popped up, but I'll read the first one, which is, it says, "Thank you for your wonderful, thought-provoking talk. Do you have any thoughts on how technology could play a role in humanizing others or otherwise reducing moral disengagement?"
No, this is a very good question. if I had had more time, I had a few paragraphs actually to discuss the role of social media, the internet. It's a double-edged kind of tool. Before we had social media, we were very limited in terms of the influence we could exercise on social policies, government, and so on. But now that we have social media, it makes it easier. On the other hand, people who are there to spread their own messages, and to undermine actually what we try to do from a moral perspective. They have also the same amount of time, the same access. So yes, it's a very powerful, and we need more presence on the social media, not less, in order to counteract the impact of the bad effect of the bad social media. Let's put it this way, okay? So we need more of it, and it is a very powerful tool. It's there, it is there to be used.
Okay, good. Any thoughts on the school shootings that have recently occurred in the United States? My Texas relatives all attribute them to generic evil and not guns.
Well, I don't live in the US. I live in Canada, as you know, so it's a very different culture. We have a different way to go about firearms, but it does reflect tremendous malaise, to say the least, and how strong, how powerful politics and lobby is to try to counteract what would be the right thing to do from a moral perspective. Because every time I see an incident such as the one that you just referred to, and I watch the news on all channels in the US. I have access to many channels, going from, the CNN to the other one that I will not mention, okay? So people feel sorry, their heart is bleeding, and they feel, and it's always about, well, we need to do something. And in the end, nothing happens. And even though we have something on which the Democrats and the Republicans may agree, they will agree on something as long as it does not involve any significant, powerful action. So how much more time it's going to take? I think this is a field in which the US citizens, including psychology, could take a stand and use their lobby at the Congress to keep it on the front burner. Okay, it takes a time to build momentum that is strong enough, because in the end, politicians are sensitive to only one thing: the number of votes in their favor. They look at who will vote and how they feel about firearms. And that culture is well ingrained. It has survived many powerful attacks on trying to reduce the access to firearms. Each time it's because the lobby against, in favor, in support of arms is very strong. They have a lot of money, but we need to persevere. There's one thing I've learned in life: if the cause is good, you go after it, you use the social media, you put it on the forefront all the time, you keep on working at it. It's only a matter of time. Sooner or later, people will get it, will understand, and there will be a buildup of the momentum that will bring about the changes that are needed to bring in the type of protection that, from a moral perspective, would make a lot more sense. If the best way to protect yourself is to kill the other person, it has limits. But if there is another way, and there are other ways to protect, to ensure, the safety of everyone in society, is to look at your humanity, the person I kill, and so on. And the other thing also that is very different from Canada and other countries in the US is the what I call the access to mental health services. It's very difficult to have access to that in the US in comparison with other countries. So people who would need help, not easy for them to get that kind of help. So there are many, many ways to address that issue. And I think in the end, it's always in the end about political will. And you need to build, to go after over a long period of time, continue to build. And as you have more and more incidents, as they occur more and more often, it will become more and more difficult for people to go against what many people would like to have, which is, let's try to do what other countries have done with firearms. Let's have to have a better control over their use and have other ways, explore other ways to ensure the safety of our citizens.
Thank you. It's a hard topic, so we'll go right from that hard topic to the topic of Ukraine in this final question, which is that the first part of the discussion seemed to be a repetition of what we see every night on the nightly news about Ukraine. How do we as individuals deal with such clear examples of dehumanization?
There's a wide range of things about that. Is the danger that, because we have it every night, the danger is that we get used to it. So the last thing to do is to get used to that. So the power, it's always important to remember every night, those are human beings. You know, they're just like the people I know, people in my family. We need to bring in the humanity every single night. Otherwise, we will become more or less insensitive to this. And even the media will stop, putting that on air and so on. They will reduce the amount of time that is used to cover those news. The second thing is we all have a psychology. Okay, first at the national level or international level. At the national level, we're all dealing with governments. I'm glad to say that in Canada, in the US, in many other countries around the world, people are doing things to try to support Ukraine. Now, let me bring in here a very wonderful dilemma to show how difficult it is to address as an individual in terms of thinking, in terms of how do you position yourself on that kind of thing. So you have the NATO countries that have selected to say, we're going to send in support, maybe arms, aids, and so on. But we're not going to be there to help and fight those who have invaded Ukraine. We're going to stay away from this. Why? Because we do not want this situation to deteriorate. And if it does deteriorate, it could put the people, my own citizens, in danger. I don't want to do that. It's like, someone in a family, I see violence in the street. I'll think about it twice before I intervene if I am with my family, because I want to protect my family. I have a double duty to intervene, but at the same time, I have to protect my family. Now, you have in the Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that says, we are all members of the same family, the human family. And Article 3 says explicitly, no discrimination on any grounds. I have a terrible dilemma when I hear the NATO, the Secretary General, who says, we're not going to intervene because we want to protect, we do not want a situation to deteriorate. On the other hand, this can be an easy way to disengage from the situation to some extent, because we all know the literature about bullying, about aggression. And we know that people who rule, govern using fear as a tool are sensitive and respond to only one thing, is fear, their own interest, okay? And Putin has started to invade Crimea, then another country, and then now he's doing it to Ukraine. The mistake that the world did at the time of world government was we didn't do anything. We tolerated in the interest of making sure that it will not deteriorate. As psychologists, we know what message do we send out when we do that. This is like a kid at home who misbehave. And I say, I will not say anything because it could get worse. Now, if I don't say anything, what do you think will happen the next day? The kid will go further. It will continue to push, the limits of what can be tolerated. This is what autocrats do in the world. This is what people like Putin do, in the world. So the implication would have been, we have a lesson from the Second World War where we exercise exactly the same reasoning. We said, oh, if Germany will invade Poland, okay, maybe they will stop there. And the next country, maybe they will stop there. Until when? Until there was an attack in their own backyard. Until they were directly concerned, this is when they decided to do something. Now, there is something to say about making sure that the situation will not deteriorate. But at the same time, this can be easily used as a way to morally disengage, because if I intervene, let's say on the first day, let's say that the NATO would have said, sorry, Ukraine. Well, Ukraine, it's true, you're not a member of NATO, but you belong to the human family. You are a democratic country. We share the same values. We're going to make an exception. We're going to help you. And we're going to push back the Russians into their country. We're not going to attack Russia. That's not a problem. The problem is the invasion. We're going to push them back. If they had done that and give Putin, let's say, 24 hours, you go back or else, and we put everything we have online, what do you think would happen? We will never know. We will never know. But it's not impossible to think that he would have withdrawn and maybe would have had a second thought, because we know something about that kind of character. We have research in literature can then help us to predict that kind of behavior. When you know this and this about this individual, you have also lessons from history, and you have now history repeating itself. Okay, so what people have been doing, it's everything going from an individual action, such as I know people around here who have opened their house in order to greet a family that is a refugee in the country. Other people are sending money. Other people are volunteering their services to help. I know another person who left the armed forces here, the unit, to go to Ukraine. They cannot speak the language, but they say, I'm a cook in the army, so I can cook for them over there, okay? So he saw that way. And personally, I will tell you, if I had been 30 years younger, 40 years younger, maybe I would have volunteered and enrolled. Of course, I would have had to check, am I going to be a nuisance? Because you need to speak the language and you need military training. You're more useful. But short of that, it just reflects the fact that many people felt very strongly about this, and it's everyone's responsibility to find ways to press the government to do more locally, to do more individually, to ask themselves, what is it that I can do as an individual to make sure that we do not forget, to make sure that these people get all the attention, all the help they need, and even to resolve that war. Once the horse is out of the barn, it's very difficult to bring the horse back into the barn. Sometimes you need to ride with the horse until the horse is exhausted. It's not a good news, but in the meantime, we do have responsibility, and something certainly that everyone can do is beware of getting used to it. Always put humanity at the forefront so that you don't lose it, and you continue to be on alert in terms of what you can do individually, in your community, regionally, nationally, internationally. One more example I will use, it is about psychology. I've seen a number of statements put out by psychology associations with regard to Ukraine. It goes from something like, we are with you, we support you, our heart goes out to you and so on. We feel for you. And denouncing, of course, the action from Russia, saying we condemn this attack. Okay, good. But imagine for a moment that you are Ukrainian and you live in Ukraine. Initially, that message, that's okay, it's soothing. But it's not good enough. We are in deep trouble here, okay? And therefore, we need to go beyond that. I saw only a very few organizations in psychology who dared to go further and try to support the governments that were going further than saying, we feel for you, we condemn, this is horrible act. So to support the organizations, the countries, the government that have decided to go beyond that and to put in money, provide aids, provide arms, and what have you, economic sanctions, anything that you can think of that can have an impact. In psychology, I've seen psychological organizations, I have emails, I know what I'm talking about, saying clearly, well, this is not our business. Anyway, psychological organizations have no impact on this. Come on, give me a break. Anything, if you want to go from point A to point B, which may be 1,000 miles away, it starts with the first step. There is no small steps that are useless. Everything's add up. So our actions combined with the actions of other disciplines, even within our disciplines, some associations up there to say, for the time being, we're just going to suspend the membership. We're going to, not attend any conferences in that country, and we're not going to accept any papers from that country outside. Okay, so it's isolation because it sends out a message, for example, to our colleagues in Russia to say this cannot be business as usual. If we continue to be business as usual, what does it say? We live in our ivory tower, totally detached from the rest of the world. Is that humanization? I don't think so. If that's what it is, I live on a different planet. So this is what it entails. So even within our organizations, provincial, state, there are things we can do to try. We're not talking here about going after, for example, Russian psychologists don't live in our countries who are honorable citizens and they try to do our best. We're not talking about that. We're talking about putting pressure on the government and anything in Russia that can help to put pressure on the government. I have another situation. It's a bit different. It is in China. What I see now in China, because of the situation with COVID, because of the closing of China on the outside world, you have more and more people who say, I'm not going to China for a conference, and who are canceling the conference, who are voting against having a conference in China. And I see Chinese colleagues in psychology, they say, we have to go to our government because we're aware now of this organization in China, that one, and that one, where everything has been canceled. We're being isolated. So there are impacts through our own channels that can be used to exercise pressure on national government that is responsible for the aggression, for the attack. It takes a little bit of time, but we just cannot maintain business as usual. So this is part of the responsibility that we have in psychology and also as individuals.
Well, Janel, we could obviously have this conversation continue for quite some time. There's so much to talk about because your presentation has been so evocative and provocative for sure. I want to thank you very much for your time and your presentation. You've taken us from your kind of incisive presentation of Bandura's model of the mechanisms of disengagement to a more hopeful picture regarding the power of resolute moral engagement and the power of humanizing, simply the common humanity that we can access to address, the ways in which moral courage and connection with others can really make a difference. So I want to thank you on behalf of everyone gathered today, on behalf of Division 52, to have honored our celebration. And we look forward to further contact, and thanks so much from everyone gathered for your terrific presentation, thoughtful, incisive, and excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Be well. Take care.
Okay, signing off.
Thanks, everyone.